Elizabeth Becker is an award-winning author and journalist who has covered national and international affairs as a Washington correspondent at the New York Times, all right, a senior foreign editor at NPR, and a Washington Post correspondent. She has won awards from the Robert Kennedy Book Awards, Overseas Press Club, and DuPont Columbia, and was part of the New York Times staff that won the 2002 Pulitzer for public service. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the Board of Directors of Oxfam and the Arthur Burns Foundation. She also was an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and the 2008 Edelman Fellow at Harvard's John Shorenson Center for the Press. Press Politics and Public Policy at Kennedy School of Government, excuse me. Her essays and opinion pieces appear frequently in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the International Herald Tribune, and she has contributed to Asian, European, and American magazines and journals. And she's a hometown girl. She holds a degree in South Asian Studies from the UW, and I hear is a graduate of West Seattle High, so all right. She's the author of When the War Was Over from 1986, for which she won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Citation, and America's Vietnam War from 1992. And her new book is Overbooked, The Exploding Business of Travel and Tourism. And it's the subject of tonight's talk, so please offer your warmest Seattle welcome for Elizabeth Becker.
I've learned just in the few weeks that I've been talking about my book that I have to say, first of all, I'm not going to try to talk you out of traveling. Travel sensibly, travel thoughtfully, but yes, I'm not going to be the horrible scold who says, no, you have to stay home. You heard from the introduction that I've been concerned about international affairs for several decades. And I have to admit, until I started working on this book, I had never even thought about tourism. It was something I did when I wasn't being serious. And I think most of you are the same way. You have serious work and you do serious things, and then you take a trip. And something happened in the last decade that made me change my mind. My last beat was international economics at the New York Times, which is when I became interested in economic development in the developing world, trade, that sort of stuff. And I kept bumping into tourism. Poor countries were going to use tourism to get wealthy, and rich countries were using tourism to stay wealthy. And there was no place to put it in the paper. And so the result is this book. I've organized it according to why we travel, culture, consumer, nature, and then the importance of travel in terms of the world with the giants, the United States and China. So, Sunday at the Louvre Museum in Paris. This is the epitome of tourism. France was the first country who got it. And it's the first country that I profile in the book. They just got it. They were, the English started visiting France in the 19th century, and they figured, how are we going to milk these people? These strange English who want to spend all this time along the blustery Normandy coast. And they figured it out. The first country to give their people paid vacations. Leon Blum, the socialist prime minister between the wars in the 1930s. They were the first country to organize transportation, culture, all those sort of things around tourism. And they were doing quite well until the Second World War sort of flattened out their economies. So when the United States came around and said, we have a Marshall Plan, what do you want us to do with it? They said, let's revive the tourism industry. So our American aid, as it would do later in other countries, helped revive tourism in Paris. And this is as if you're in one of Claude Monet's paintings, and this is Giverny. And the key to French tourism and why it is now the #1 tourist destination in the world is because they figured out the best way to attract people is to stay French. So all that you say, oh, they're so arrogant, they cling to everything that's so French. Well, that's exactly why everybody wants to go there. It's not homogenized like everybody else. So you have a country that's smaller than Texas, that is the #1 draw consistently, and is so popular that, for instance, 2 years ago, more Chinese visited Paris than visited all of the United States. So that's what happens when you know what you're doing. And Bordeaux is very interesting to me because it reminds me of Seattle. See how beautiful it is? A few years ago, it sort of looked like, you know, the waterfront in Seattle, where where you have the Alaskan Way Viaduct and you can't tell which way is going what. 10 years ago, an incredibly talented politician named Alain Juppé became the mayor. And he's, in the French system, he's also a national figure and has had his ups and downs like most national politicians around the world. But he, in fact, under Sarkozy, he was the Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs. But he was devoted to his hometown, Bordeaux. And as the mayor, he did what you are about to do. He tore down the mess along the river. He cleaned up all the buildings. He put in electric light rail. He made pedestrian areas. He did everything that the people of Bordeaux wanted to have happen so that their city became the gem it was in the late 18th, early 19th century. And it's now, as you know, it's the capital of the Bordeaux vineyards. And when I had the pleasure of living in Paris for 4 years, and you would never go to Bordeaux for vacation, never. It was, you stayed away from it. You went to the vineyards and had some wine. And famously, the American Robert Parker, who gives all the grades to wine, he refused to ever stay there until this happened. And he wrote, after the renovation, he gave the city of Bordeaux his personal rating. I remember the old days and the rotten, abandoned buildings on the waterfront, and now it is a ravishing destination. And for Robert Parker, that's high praise. So this is what might happen to you if you get hurt. And if I'm on the East Coast, I always bring up the Boston Big Dig, so I adapt. And now this is where tourism got away with it, went away. This is called being loved to death. I think these are Chinese tourists, but Venice is now a town of only 60,000 people, and every year between 20 and 24 million tourists visit this town. Isn't that amazing? And so you have, this is what happens when you're loved to death. You have rents go up, so the locals can't afford to stay in their cities, so they have to go to the mainland. You have greedy, sometimes corrupt politicians who see all this money and allow for zoning to be ignored. And you have, so shopkeepers lose their shops, and you have no more butchers, no more bakers, and in their place you have crummy souvenir shops and boutiques that you would find in Paris or Rome or New York or Seattle. So you have the hollowing out of society. Then you have the phony souvenirs coming in, so that real Murano glass, in fact, comes from Eastern Europe or China. Those great masks don't come from Venice. The beautiful paper doesn't come from Venice. And so the artisans start to go away. And you have what the Venetians now are afraid is Disneyland. And you have this. Now, they're not supposed to, originally, you weren't supposed to have these cruise, look at, it looks like King Kong. The size of that cruise ship and then the beautiful Venetian cityscape. You know, there's no cars allowed in Venice. And there was no pollution until these guys came. And now you have what you all must know is, you know, cruise ship haze, that pollution. An idling ship using their fuel is the equivalent of 12,000 idling cars. And I met with, and you'll be introduced to the Venetians who are trying to get control of this. And Italy is one of those governments that's when it's good, it's very good, and when it's bad, it's pretty awful. When my husband Bill Nash is here, and he traveled with me a lot, and when we were there, UNESCO had an ad in the paper, the International Herald Tribune, warning that instead of worrying about aqua alta, the rising water, which we're all worried about, that the city would find itself in its watery grave because of too many tourists. Okay. This is the tourism gone bad on a developing country. As you heard, Cambodia was a country that I've been living in and covering for many years. And after the war ended and there was finally peace, all my Cambodian friends said, yes, now tourism will bring us back and everybody will know how wonderful we were. Instead, again, whenever you see something good or something bad, it's usually the government behind it. And this one, it's the government as well. Cambodia is easily one of the most beautiful countries, this rich culture, and it's allowed flooding of tourism. So Angkor, which is one of the largest collection of religious buildings in the world, is being overrun. It's the temples are not meant for even the kind of prayer that we have in our Christian churches. This was meant for just the elite worship. And now you have several million every year in a country that does not have the infrastructure that you would want for tourists, so that you have a forest of hotels around it. And as you know, tourists take up much more water than the locals, so it's completely ruined the sewage, the regular water. And in fact, the water table is drying out, and the temples are sinking. And in several cases, it's very bad. So this is just not doing well for the cultural heritage. Then in terms of how does it help poor people, this is an instance where they're not making sure that the money stays local. The French make sure that the money stays local. Here, the money is either going into the pockets of some corrupt business people or politicians, but it's also going to the international. So that this is in a province called Siem Reap. And before the tourism boom, it was one of the wealthiest per capita. Now it is the poorest because the money is going in and out. I'll just briefly touch on some of the other things. It's also been really horrible in terms of sex tourism. That was not an issue until the tourism boom, and now it's very, very common for a family in a cycle of poverty to sell a daughter. And that's one of the most, that's the moral blight of industrialized tourism nowadays. There's something called genocide tourism now. Has anybody ever heard of this? No. You can go to a travel agent and say, I want to do a genocide tour, and you will be sold a ticket to Europe to see the Holocaust sites, to Rwanda, to Sierra Leone, and to Cambodia. I'll just throw it out there. And then, finally, in their push to make more money and to bring more tourists, they have done something that's become all too common in the developing world. They've done land grabs where they throw the locals off the land and build resorts and casinos in its place. So all those things that we don't like. This is neighboring Thailand. Thailand didn't get off on the right foot necessarily when they started tourism, but they're flipping, and they're now trying to use tourism. That's me learning supposedly how to cook, how to reinforce the culture through tourism. So they're accenting stuff like this. They have made tourism their wealthiest sector. Even though Thailand is normally the country that exports the most rice, tourism brings them more money than rice. This is just another example of anything can be packaged as tourism now, which is one of the reasons that I did this book. Tourism now accounts for 1 out of every 11 jobs in the world. 1 out of 11. There's no other sector like this. For the global economy, it provides $6.4 trillion. That's a T, trillion dollars. And you have this is a Seattle sort of industry as well. So one of the fastest growing sectors is cruise cruises. It's like, I call it the fast food of tourism. For all kinds of, I think, obvious reasons. It's distorted why you travel to an easily packaged trip. So when you think of travel, you think of adventure, you think of going someplace foreign, getting to know something new, losing yourself in a new culture, new people. This, you get on the boat, you stay in the same bed, for instance, in this trip, 5 days with 2 excursions of 2 hours each. The cruise ship had nothing to do with Mexico, which is where this is, or Belize. No lectures on the culture. The lectures were only how to spend money once you got on board, literally at diamond shops and in the art galleries. And then, most importantly for a Seattle audience, the environmental pollution is unbelievable. I'll just read. What happens every day when a cruise ship is out to sea? According to the Environmental Protection Agency, in the course of 1 day, the average cruise ship produces 21,000 gallons of human sewage, 1 ton of solid waste garbage, 170,000 gallons of wastewater from showers, sinks, and laundry, 6,400 gallons of oily bilge water from the engines, 25 pounds of batteries, and of course 8,500 plastic bottles. Once you leave the shore, there's no more environmental rules that you follow. And cruise ships companies, the 2 major ones are Carnival and Royal Caribbean. They take up 2/3 of the market. They are headquartered in the United States, Miami. All their ships are in American ports. Yet, because their ships are flagged and registered overseas, they don't pay most corporate taxes, and they don't follow labor or environmental rules. So you get what I just described. And that's the chapter that seems to get the most attention. This is the other side, and we all know. This is in Costa Rica, which is sort of one of the great pioneers of ecotourism, and it's just the flip side of what I just was describing. Again, the government and the national culture and the national character shows up in how they have tourism. Costa Rica was a poor country in Central America. The Spanish didn't find mineral wealth there, and it's too mountainous and rocky and jungly to make it an agricultural country, so it was left alone. And as you know, it gradually developed a character where it doesn't have an army. More than half of the country is protected preserves of forests, jungles. And eventually one of their leaders won the Nobel Prize for ending the wars of its neighbors. That's who they are, and not surprisingly, they discovered that the best way to protect who they are was to make a tourism that, as they put it, monetized their wildlife. So now it's like a biosphere of sorts. It has more butterflies and bird species than North America combined. It's astonishing. And tourists pay to keep it going. It's one of the major sectors of Costa Rica, and Costa Rica, as a result, has one of the strongest middle classes in the region. This is the size of the boats they allow. They don't allow huge, mammoth, King Kong boats. And this is what you do all day. You don't sit around drinking and going to shows. You go out and you see the wildness. And Africa. What surprised me about Africa is that the debate is still going on whether or not the wildlife parks is a proper thing, or whether a proper African expression of itself, or whether it's a European colonial leftover. And the countries are finally realizing that this is their culture, and their first thing that they were talking about tourism with me was to get the Africans to go to their own parks. And you will be astonished at the number of Africans who have never seen an elephant But they are using the parks to bring in tourism dollars and also to protect them. The other fun thing to learn is that we have American philanthropists, including a local, who are helping keep them together. Paul Allen is the not-so-anonymous donor to the park that I visited right here in Zambia. Greg Carr, another internet millionaire, is single-handedly reviving a park in Mozambique, so that wilderness is becoming so rare that philanthropists are now trying around the world to figure out how to protect wilderness. And whenever they have that plan, the first thing on their item is, how do we get rich tourists to come and spend their money there? And then, if you listen to NPR, you've heard the last few days the rhino series. And just today, they had a spot where they talked about Kenya burning all the tusks. Well, Richard Leakey is the man behind that, who you'll meet in my book too. And tourism is actually helping save the elephant. They have rhinoceroses in much worse shape than the elephants, but without tourism, they figured they would not have any more elephants. So there is very much a double-edged sword here about tourism, good and bad. And how many people have been to China as tourists? Yeah. This is the giant. It's amazing. When Deng Xiaoping first wrested power in late 79, early 80, late 78, early 79, he gave a series of speeches, of course, that I'd never heard of until I had to do the research, on tourism and the importance of tourism, not only for the economy, but for the political personality of China. And he was convinced that if China developed a good tourism that would bring all the Westerners in, then you could change their impression of what China was. And it worked. When I was in China, I corralled some Americans who had never been to China before, and they lived in the Washington area. They took the New York Times every day, the Washington Post. They thought they're very well educated, and they were shocked at what they found. And let me just read a couple of things they said. Oh, they're all medical doctors too. What surprised them? The size of the buildings, the way people dress is unbelievable. So is the hustle, the commerce, the airport. When we landed, it was like being any place in the US, only not as crowded. We can't believe how modern this country, and we haven't seen any police. I thought this was a police state. I thought the people would be solemn and dreary. They aren't. And that's another side of tourism. Tourism is like public diplomacy. It's very hard to find a tourist who's been to the United States and hasn't fallen in love with something of us. I mean, it is such a good investment. When you have good tourism, it is amazing. And the Chinese figured that too. And the first thing that they did after figuring out they wanted to do tourism was to teach their own people how to be tourists. They, like the French, they instituted paid vacations. They're called Golden Weeks. And now Chinese spend $123 billion in their own country every year as tourists. So it helps the economy. And now, we talked about elephants and tourism saving elephants. Well, tourism has saved the panda. And I wrote down panda and the death penalty because one of the ways to make sure that pandas aren't killed for their fur the way they used to, as elephants and rhinos are killed for their horns, is that the Chinese told me that the best way to do that is just you kill anybody you catch. It's not something you all are going to do, I don't think. And to round it out, my hometown, Washington, D.C., like so many other things, the United States is the exception to the rule on tourism. I talked about governments and the good governments, not so good. the United States has decided that the government has nothing to do with tourism, which is a real trick because the product of tourism is the country, and it's very hard to keep the government out. But tourism was one of the first casualties of what we now know as our completely bollocksed up government. In 1994, when the Republicans first won control of the House under Newt Gingrich, they made a provision of their Contract America to get rid of the government in tourism. So the tourism agency that we had within the Commerce Department, their budget was zeroed out. And all the embassies around the world, the American embassies, were told they could no longer help their foreigners learn how to come to the United States. So in the decade when tourism took off, that would be from 95 onwards, the United States was flat. Now, the reason tourism took off was because of several things. One was the end of the Cold War, which opened up half of the world. That makes sense. The revolution in transportation, we all know that from Boeing. All of a sudden, now planes can go halfway across the globe in nonstop service. You hear that every day on the Emiratis airline company. And you had the internet revolution. So you had everything was perfect along with the growth of the middle class. Well, the United States would have none of this. And so government is out of tourism. And then we had, of course, the attacks of 9/11. I was in the New York Times Washington Bureau when that happened. And of course, I can tell you, tourism never came up as a single news meeting. We didn't even think about it. It was all national security, homeland security. And I think it was about 5 or 6 years in, the tourism industry all of a sudden raised its hand and said, you may be overdoing it because fingerprinting, rectal examinations, the profiling, so that they kept statistics and as well as testimonials, which was easy to find if you read a foreign newspaper. Europeans, the people you want to have come to your country, rich Europeans and Asians and rich South Americans and rich Africans, they were not coming. They were not coming at all. They were going every place but the United States, and they were telling the United States why they weren't coming. They were tired of being humiliated and harassed and so on and so forth. And so at least half of the tourists, and this is a flatlining as the rest of the world is going up, were day trippers from either Canada or Mexico, which you would know that. So that in 1995, when essentially the whole world opened up at the end of the Cold War, 500 million foreign trips were made every year. Last year, it hit 1 billion. So in a world of just a little over 7 billion people, we have 1 billion trips every year. And the United States wasn't taking advantage of this. There's all kinds of examples of this, and you'll laugh at least. Anyway, so what finally did it was the election of Barack Obama in a funny way. Remember, the senator from Illinois, the first year he's president, went to Copenhagen to argue that Chicago should be the site of the 2016 Summer Olympics. And it was one of the finalists. And he was treated like royalty in Europe, finally a handsome young, we love him, we love Michelle. And he thought he had it in the bag. Then he goes and makes his case to the Olympic Committee, and he was told, no way are we going to subject our athletes and our populations to what you put your people through at the border. Now, this is not what he was prepared to talk about how Chicago is going to make these great stadiums, and he did not think he'd have to defend border policies. And finally, one of the few people who came out publicly to talk about it was a member of the committee named Saeed Shahid Ali from Pakistan. And he said publicly that it would be too hard for the athletes and most of the people entering the United States, that it would be a rather harrowing experience and they could not do it. President Obama got the message. And over the last few years, it's not been the top burner issue. You have never read about it in the newspaper, but he's slowly but surely starting to change it. He's set up for the very first time, with finally cooperation from Congress, the first website for the US government to have. If you can imagine in this day and age where you go on the website for any country and you find every language available and how to get around here and what you want to do if you want to go hiking, the United States said no. So if you're from Portugal and you don't know the name of Amtrak and you don't speak English, you're in trouble. So they finally have it's called Discover USA, and it's rather, it's simple. But they finally had that. They finally have a transportation idea and so on and so forth. But most importantly, they've changed the visa policy so that wealthy Chinese and wealthy Brazilians have an easier time to get a visa. They have more consulates. Every one of those people who come is the equivalent of a 6,000 person stimulus package, as the president put it. And they're starting to see how can you take advantage of it, and you know, everybody wants to become the next France. And so the book is trying to say this is a very important industry. It is on its way to becoming the biggest global sector in the world. And especially here in the United States, it should be taken seriously. The government has a huge role in it, whether it wants to admit it or not. And if you don't admit it, it's probably going to be a negative role. And there can be good sides as well as bad sides, and to look for the good sides. And so I always end with the happy tourist in Costa Rica. Thank you. So, discussion, questions? Yep.
1994, why did the Republicans do that?
Well, there's one other piece of political history that is also part of this. It's that because of states' rights, every state has its tourism agency. So you have this built-in suspicion of federal role. For instance, when I would go to different, for this, I went to all these tourism fairs where you had beautiful booths from Nepal, from India, from Spain, and then you'd have a string of motley 20 different states with their little somethings. And so it's very hard for a foreigner to say, do I want to go canoeing in Delaware or where's Montana? And at the same time, not wanting to give up control over their tourism. So you have that political fight that's been going since the Constitution was written. And then on top of it, government, that has been the creed. Government out of X, Y, and Z, that the invisible hand of the free market, et cetera, which of course, that's an exaggeration, but I quote a Republican ambassador, Ambassador Connie Morella, who was the ambassador to the OECD in Paris during the Iraq War. And when she was sent there, she was a former member of Congress, and the ambassadorship was her reward for good work. She was preparing for defending her country in the teeth of the Iraq War and the protests. And she said, to her surprise, the main problem she had was tourism. That the rest of the developed world understood the importance of tourism, that you had to do research, you had to do real serious thinking about it. And so whenever a budget had to be approved from Washington, they'd say, take tourism out of it. So it's an ideology, and it's always hard to totally describe ideology, but it is very firmly held that. And I don't think it's going to last because a lot of the industry is Republican, but I don't know. Yep. Oh, sorry. Yes, okay.
You spent most of your talk discussing tourism or leisure travel. Can you talk a little bit about business travel, like the relative size or maybe per capita impact of a business traveler compared to a leisure travel?
The industry is called, thank you for the question, it's called travel and tourism because the industry itself says it's very hard to sort through the motivation that a lot of business travel is not. The easiest way to describe it would be through something called MICE, meetings, incentives, conventions, and events. And that's the way that the industry divides it. And it's becoming one of the most important sectors of the economy. I'll say something like 30%, but that might be a little generous. To show you how important it was, when China opened Macau up for gambling, halfway around the world in Las Vegas, they lost a lot of money. The high rollers and the high wagers all went to Macau. And Las Vegas had to say, what are we going to do? They still have gambling, obviously, but it's not the core moneymaker. And it's conventions. And they routinely top the most visited, biggest tourist spot in America still, but that's on the basis of the conventions, convention travel. Europe, Germany in particular, is using business conventions and things like that to win over, and they're discovering a lot of people. That's their tourism. They go to a convention and then they take the added trip. They're in Rome and they might as well go down to Naples, sort of thing. So it's an important sector. And another thing that sort of brings this out is medical tourism. You all have it. You all know about it. It's becoming, it's not just Canada and Mexico anymore, although it is important. Countries in Africa, Europe, and Asia are getting a lot of Americans by twin packages of Ministry of Health and Ministry of Tourism will offer you an operation in Kuala Lumpur and rest and recuperation at the local beach for a price that's 1/10 of what you would have had to pay in the United States. And enough Americans, even with Obamacare, are not going to be able to afford some of the health care they need, that they continue to do it. And so is that tourism? Do we think of that as tourism? But everything is being packaged that way. So it's a very important, the business side is becoming very important. Yes?
So we were kind of hoping to hear a little bit around the other side, like the tourist itself. So without getting mired in a lot of the cultural bigotries that are there and we're not going to change, to be a conscientious traveler, do you have any kind of tips and best bits of advice for your travels? Not step your foot in the pool so much?
Yeah. This was not written as a consumer book. It was written as industry, but I hope that when you read it, you'll come to a couple of conclusions. I try not to force feed. But what I found is that a lot of us are very lazy when we prepare a trip. And if you just did your homework, you'd be 3/4 of the way there. And it's not that hard. There are lots of sites. If you're worried about your footprint, I didn't mention Dubai in the Middle East, which has the worst footprint ever. And so if you just, there are websites, and it's all through here, of how you can see where the footprints are in air conditioning. If you go to a place where you're going to be skiing in the middle of the desert or ice skating, you know that that's wrong, right? So, but I'm serious. And so in consumer tends to be, the consumer tourism destinations tend to be the most. You'll see here, I rely a lot on the National Geographic. It's a great website. And there are numbers and numbers. It's just so easy. I could mention CREST. I mentioned sustainable travel grading, where you can grade, and I grade one of my trips. The Costa Rica trip, I show you how to grade it. So is how the locals, are they showing you the trip? Like, these were local Costa Rican biologists and botanists who were leading the trip. It wasn't a foreigner. Are you buying local artisan souvenirs? Is the food local? And you'll find all of these charts in the book. I show you, I do it so it shows it, but I'm not a consumer, but you'll see that. And And then pretty soon you'll see, and you'll be able to recognize the companies that are appealing to you as well. But the UN has websites. There's lots of wonderful websites.
Common sense, don't be lazy and stay local.
Yeah, and also go where you know someone. And it doesn't hurt to go where you speak a language. I say that to American crowds. Yes?
So I happen to love the Caribbean and not the resort cruise part of the Caribbean, but when I look around, I'm very interested in sustainable tourism. None of the sustainable tourism companies do much with the Caribbean. Do you have any sense of what's going on with that, or why? Is it just so overrun with resorts and cruises that people have given up?
There are small ones. There are small ones, and you can find those in they always win the top awards because they're fighting such a long odds. One of the reasons is the cruise industry, and I'm not being a dead horse here, but it's just become so industrialized that they practically own the ports, so that when you get off a ship, you have to go through Diamonds Internationals. And you'll see I tried to figure out just how close they are. There's a business relationship, but it's hidden. They're Diamond, and they only started in the last 20 years, but all of a sudden Diamond Internationals are everywhere. They're up in Alaska where the cruise ships are. So there are, it's just part and parcel, and different Caribbean countries are trying to figure out how to get out of it. They create something called sacrifice zones where, like in Belize, they'll let the tourists from cruise ships go to one part of a park because they know it'll be trashed, and then they keep them out of the others. In the cruise, one of the cruise, I interviewed a cruise CEO, and he said the best thing for cruise tourists, in fact, is to go to made-up spots. Remember during the Haiti earthquake, Royal Caribbean was shamed into making contributions. Well, that's because they went to an island that the cruise passengers didn't even know it was Haiti. And it was all fabricated. And that's really good for a cruise passenger because it is a consumer. They're not looking for Haitians. They're looking for a beach, and they're looking for a cool lunch and a nice drink and hanging out. And maybe that may be the answer. But they're dealing with it. And there's some resorts that are conscientious, 5 senses, 7 senses, that some of the most expensive ones are the ones who don't have air conditioning, who have old-fashioned fans and have the old stuff, and they cost a lot more money. Yeah. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you view the role and emergence of online travel agencies? And then what do you think of the carbon offsets that they provide as a service as you buy your package on the website?
I have a renewed respect for travel agents after this. It's hard to figure stuff out. It's hard you don't know the geography, you don't know what's available. And again, that's part of the homework, is that you need an expert. In most things, you need experts to help you. And so I now have my husband and I have a travel agent because we just now respect how much more they can help me. And they know you're looking for something that's eco-wise, and then, so I'm a big fan of them. And they're slightly coming back. Offsets, yes, why not? The most impressive were the ones that the industry themselves do. Like Marriott Hotels is underwriting a 2 million acre rainforest in Brazil. That's in here too. So and if you tell the industry I'm on this trip because I know you do these offsets, that helps too. A lot of travelers just plant there's all these trees you can plant in Ireland, and I think it helps, but I also think what really helps is not to have that big a footprint in the first place, and there are ways to get around that. Yeah.
I think my question relates to that. If you were the global czar of travel and tourism, what would be your end game, and how would you start?
Yeah. Well, I I can't answer. I say here I can't answer that question. I think people make too many mindless trips, way too many mindless trips, and I don't think they stay long enough to even know where they are. I would suggest fewer trips, but stay longer, to remember why you travel in the first place. If it's just a change of pace, you can, drive to Portland. You don't have to fly, halfway across the world. I would say, be conscientious as a tourist, but also be conscientious as a citizen, so that be careful about what you're allowing in your own place. One of the things I found is that nobody's mentioned volunteer tourism, which is something that a lot of younger people want to do, and retired people. That seems to be just. It's funny, the tourists who are volunteer tourists, the best are the ones who do volunteering in their hometown. Then they're good when they go over. The ones who don't do any volunteering are useless. And it's the same when, the better you know your home community and your home country and your home culture, the more you're going to get out of another one. I mean, if you've never been to a church and you go to Notre Dame, what's going on here? So that's what my czar would do. They'd say, get to know your own community before you go. Huh? Yeah, dig deep, much deeper, and try. One of the funnest parts was I lived just a few blocks from the Library of Congress. I'm very lucky. And I would just go and read the old Baedekers, the old guides. What they did before a trip is unbelievable. These guides were written by the best scholars of the day. And you had to memorize language, and you had to know history. And at the very end, the last 2 or 3 pages of a 150-page book, you'd say, oh, by the way, you might want to stay at this hotel, that place. The consumer part was irrelevant. The whole point was to know this other culture and I mean, serious history, not 3 paragraphs in Lonely Planet. So, oh yes, Oxfam.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It seems like there's a strong correlation between good governance in those countries that you put up as good examples and those that you put up as bad examples. Do you see outliers in that? Are there some countries that generally are seen as having good governance but are poor at managing their tourism, or the flip side? And is there any way to explain some of that?
Thank you for asking such a difficult question. Well, Spain is one of those weirdos. It has had a rather good governments, and the tourism has been hideous. They've ruined the coast. Neighboring Portugal led the way of, recovering the monasteries and convents. And why, I don't know. It was a very strong culture. I mean, they would harken back to the days of Franco and things like that, but Spain would probably be the best example. After Franco, they had great government, and the tourism didn't work very well. However, that reminds me, the UN actually is a very good resource on all these issues, on how governance works in terms of tourism through something called the UN World Tourism Organization, which you've never heard of. It is in Madrid, and it's the only underfunded UN agency I've ever seen where they actually do good work and they don't have enough money. But a good deal of the studies that I cite on tourism, what works, what doesn't, is from the UNWTO. Yes?
Just one, I haven't heard anything about Australia. Do you have any?
Australia, tourism overtook sheep about 20 years ago. I mentioned Australia because it is a model. It's called, Australia and New Zealand are both models for environmentally correct. And when the Chinese had learned how to be tourists in their own countries, the first countries that the only countries they're allowed to go to at the beginning were Australia and New Zealand, because it's wide open, good, blah, blah, blah. They made a mess of it at first, and New Zealand and Australia had to sort of teach the Chinese operators how you do it and so on and so forth. But no, it's a high standard. There's no question it's a high standard. And the New Zealand, they all have these little mottos, but pure New Zealand really was one of the path breakers. Yeah.
What do you think it's going to take to change a lot of the throwaway culture with tourism? Like people are like, I'm on vacation, I don't need to worry about, I just have all these little disposable items at my fingertips. So because of companies are just like, yeah, people like the ease of it and not having to think about it, but that's just, yeah, all the statistics about the sheer waste it produces. Like, is it just going to take a growing eco-conscious, or what's
It'll be just as easy as getting rid of fast food. It is too seductive, and it's all over. It's not just. I mean, everybody think the Americans are the bad people. I mean, it's all over. I was amazed. And why are they taking all those photographs? It would be nice to see some tourists that are just walking without. It's constant. Who's going to see all those photographs? Yep.
How would you rate the Galapagos as far as being done well or being done badly?
It's getting mediocre grades. They're having to reconsider, and there's been some real pressure on. I think they've pulled back. I personally didn't visit it, but I know it's in trouble. They're pushing back on the number of tourists who can go, and they are pushing back on ships, poor cruise ships. I beat up on them too much. And it's going all the way down to Antarctica, where certain size of cruise ships are now completely forbidden because of fear of accidents that would be catastrophic, fragile to the fragile. So Galapagos, it's not. They have to reconsider it. Yes.
It's kind of asking for a generalization, but you've spoken a lot about countries and ones who have done tourism well or done tourism poorly. Did you come across examples of good tourists, like people who travel well?
Yeah. Well, countries do lots of studies about this because they want the good tourists. And now, despite people my age who might be surprised at this, the Japanese are among the best tourists. They appreciate culture, they spend wisely and discreetly, and they respect where they are. I was surprised at how happy people were to see Americans. Oh, it's nice to see Americans because we don't travel as much as we used to. Percentage-wise, we have a very low percentage of people with passports. I keep seeing all the people who they didn't like. But countries, like the European Union does serious studies of what tourists want and how to manipulate them to go in the right direction. And so, for instance, the Chinese do not necessarily like to visit art museums, but they like to visit the home of artists. That doesn't seem like a big distinction to you, but it means that those countries will make sure that the artist's home or the musician's home, Johann Sebastian Bach, they're going to have a Chinese translator there, and they're going to make sure that the bus stops over here and that there's Chinese, it's so, they accommodate. But the hyper shoppers, those are tough because they tend to be cheap on everything else and then complain.
2 more questions.
Okay, yes?
Yes, ma'am. If we're, contemplating traveling, different travels, would you recommend to go through a local agent or try to find someone in the destination country to?
Your local agent who knows you. And have a friend, say, this is who I am. And your local agent will be an American who will know who you are, what you really want to do, what your budget is, and help you figure it out. I definitely, and the local agent will know who in that other country, whichever country you're going to visit. Say you're going to visit Brazil, your local agent will know who to hook you up with in Brazil, because they'll have a relationship with the travel agent in Brazil. So that would be the way I would go, definitely. Yep.
You talked about how tourism has not grown that much in the United States, but I'm constantly reading about how our national parks, for instance, are just overwhelmed with too many people and underfunded, which makes sense based on what you're saying. Can you comment at all?
That's mostly domestic, and I was talking about foreign, and I'm sorry if I didn't make it clear. It was the foreign explosion, but domestic tourism, when I'm talking about tourism, I'm sorry, I don't talk about people being tourists in their own country. If we talked about people being tourists in their own country, it would be probably 3 times the number of 1 billion. But that's not, we don't have the statistics to be able to say that. The national parks are crowded in certain areas and empty in a lot of the other areas. And that's one of the park's biggest problems, is how do you direct people so that they have all these statistics that I don't understand, so I didn't put them in. But they have formulas to figuring out how many people should be in which area and so on and so forth. And if they could figure that out, they'd be doing much better. There's been much greater growth in the other kind of parks, theme parks. And those skyrocketing, and they know what to do with people. They have theme park weddings, theme park this, theme park that, yeah. But actually, when you look at the national parks are not growing anywhere near the theme parks. And if they could figure out how to scoot them around, it'd be well.
That's all the time we have for questions today, unfortunately.